43 paying ticket holders. That, according to reports, was the actual attendance at a wheelchair basketball match staged during the 2025 Invictus Games in Vancouver, Harry's signature charitable endeavor. The flagship project. The one undertaking meant to demonstrate that he could construct something legitimate on his own, outside the walls of the monarchy. 43 human beings who reached into their wallets and paid to be there. And according to investigative biographer Tom Bauer, roughly another 100 bodies were ushered in by event organizers and arranged carefully around Harry and Meghan Markle so the cameras would have something to shoot. Choreographed, fabricated. An audience assembled for the lens, not for the cause itself. Hold that picture in your head. An arena built to hold thousands. A sport rooted in courage and sacrifice, played by wounded veterans who surrendered parts of their own bodies in uniform for their nations. And 43 ticket buyers showed up. Roughly another 100 were positioned into frame like background extras on a soundstage. The wheelchair basketball itself was authentic. The athletes were authentic. The agony those athletes endured to reach that hardwood was authentic. Everything circling them was theater. Now keep that image lodged in your mind, because by the time we finish, you'll grasp precisely how the most photographed couple alive went from a reported $100 million Netflix arrangement, a $20 million Spotify contract, representation by the single most muscular talent agency in Hollywood, friendships with the Beckhams, with Oprah Winfrey, with Elton John, all the way down to a wheelchair basketball game where bodies had to be shuttled in to populate the shot. And you'll understand it not as gossip, not as tabloid overreach, but as a documented sequence. A chain of events with dates attached, names attached, internal complaints attached, and one very particular Zoom call that a Spotify executive has publicly described as one of the best stories he holds, and one he still hasn't released. But before any of that, I need to introduce you to The Shield. Because there was one figure in Hollywood whose entire purpose, by certain accounts, was making sure damaging coverage of Meghan Markle never reached print. One man whose phone calls editors actually picked up. And the instant he stepped away, every story you've since read about Meghan's professional setbacks poured through the gap he left behind. That isn't a metaphor. That's a timeline. And the timeline begins with a book. In March of 2026, Tom Bauer released his second deep dive investigation into the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The title alone signals the temperature of the contents: betrayal, power, deceit, and the fight for the future of the royal family. And I know the instinct kicks in immediately. Another royal book, another news cycle, another 10 days of headlines before everyone moves on. But Bauer isn't a palace gossip merchant recycling blind items and anonymous whispers. This is the journalist who exposed Robert Maxwell's pension fraud before any other outlet was prepared to publish it. He dismantled the political mythology surrounding Gordon Brown using source documentation while Brown was still sitting in Downing Street. Bauer's bar, and he has said this himself, is that he keeps very capable lawyers, and more importantly, he makes certain what he prints is the truth. His 2022 book on the Sussexes, Revenge, was constructed from 80 individual sources. 80 separate people willing to talk, on or off the record, to a biographer whose thoroughness borders on surgical. So when the 2026 follow-up arrives carrying claims so commercially specific and so personally damaging that the Sussex team felt compelled to issue a formal public statement, the wording they chose deserves close study. They labeled the work a deranged conspiracy. Sit with that phrase for a moment. When someone publishes sourced and verifiable claims, and your formal response is to brand the whole project a deranged conspiracy, that isn't a denial. A genuine denial says, that date is incorrect. A genuine denial says, that document does not exist. A genuine denial isolates a specific factual error and corrects it for the record. What they produced was a characterization, a tone argument. They argued Bauer had never met them, which is also true of nearly every serious investigative biographer who has ever produced credible reporting on a public figure. Bauer never sat across from Robert Maxwell either. That didn't make the pension fraud any less factual. The arithmetic on that defense simply doesn't hold. And here's the part most observers are missing. By responding publicly, By putting out a formal statement, they essentially flagged which claims inside the book they considered dangerous. Silence would have been the wiser play. Silence allows a news cycle to die quietly. A formal statement is a flare gun fired into the sky. It announces, "This one struck, and struck deeply enough that Bauer himself remarked on the irony." Their public statement drove the book to the #1 position on Amazon. They effectively became the marketing arm of the very investigation they wanted to suppress. So what's actually inside these pages that triggered that level of reaction? Let me walk you through it. Not the tabloid summary, the actual documented claims in the sequence that matters. Here is where the genuine architecture of this story begins. In April of 2023, Meghan Markle signed with William Morris Endeavor. If you don't live inside the entertainment industry, that name might not mean much. But William Morris Endeavor isn't simply a talent agency. It's the most influential representation firm in Hollywood. The agency is led by Ari Emanuel, the man who personally represents Dwayne Johnson, Mark Wahlberg, and crucially for this story, Oprah Winfrey. Signing with William Morris Endeavor isn't equivalent to hiring a publicist. It's closer to acquiring a private army. And multiple industry insiders have been unambiguous about what William Morris Endeavor's principal function for Meghan actually was. It wasn't about landing film roles or brokering brand partnerships. The central purpose was press suppression, operating as a shield. When Ari Emanuel sits in your corner, negative stories about you encounter resistance they wouldn't otherwise meet. Outlets reconsider. Editors take phone calls they wouldn't normally accept. The cost of running a critical piece climbs higher because the subject of the piece is represented by someone who controls access to half the A-list talent in town. The shield was the entire reason for the relationship. Now here's what unfolded next, and pay attention to the dates, because the dates are everything. Around Thanksgiving of 2023, Meghan reportedly threw what insiders described internally as a fit over what she perceived as insufficient attention from the agency during the holiday stretch. She then demanded a meeting in January of 2024. According to sources, she walked into that meeting expecting what was described as decks and plans, formal strategic presentations, the sort of deliverable you'd anticipate from a management consultancy, not from a talent agency. And what followed, according to multiple independent insiders, was that Ari Emanuel was done. A second source, someone with direct visibility into the agency's operations, stated plainly that William Morris Endeavor was definitively not working on Meghan's personal business going forward. Here's the contradiction that should leave your ears ringing. William Morris Endeavor publicly denied any shift in the relationship. The Sussex camp publicly denied any shift. Both parties maintained the fiction that representation remained intact, straight through into early 2026. She remained listed as a client. No public departure announcement was ever made. But behind that public veneer, no active deals were being chased on her behalf. No meetings had occurred since January of 2023. She was represented in name only, a client on paper, with no agency machinery actually working for her in practice. And one Hollywood insider made the observation that connects every story that came after. This source said on background that there's no way the Variety piece about her fallout with Netflix would have ever been published if William Morris Endeavor had still been actively looking after Meghan. Read that sentence again. The shield came down in January of 2024, and every single damaging story that's emerged since, the Netflix tensions, the collapse of her lifestyle brand, the wave of staff exits, every one of them ran inside the unprotected window that opened the moment that shield dropped. That isn't coincidence. That is cause and effect with a timestamp attached. And I want you to consider what that means for every public statement issued by the Sussex camp during that stretch. Every denial, every reassurance that things were on schedule, every meticulously worded spokesperson quote about exciting projects in the pipeline. All of it produced during a window in which the subject of those statements had no active representation, no live deals, and no agency actually working for her. The public narrative and the private reality had completely fractured, and neither party was willing to be the first to admit it. That gap between what was being said And what was actually occurring is, by my read, the single most revealing dynamic in this entire saga. Because it signals that the brand had grown more important than the business. The appearance of momentum had begun to substitute for the existence of momentum. And once that substitution takes hold, it only accelerates in one direction. But the practice of cultivating relationships until they turn inconvenient, that didn't start with Hollywood. It started much earlier. And it started with people Meghan used to call her closest friends. David Beckham and Prince Harry first connected in 2012. By 2018, the friendship had grown close enough that the Beckhams were invited to the royal wedding at Windsor Castle. Victoria Beckham had personally assisted with the interior design of Frogmore Cottage. This wasn't a celebrity acquaintance. This was a genuine, multi-year personal bond between two of the most recognizable families on Earth, and the Beckhams were unmistakably in Meghan's corner. Here is what Tom Bauer documented in his investigation titled House of Beckham. At the 2018 Invictus Games, that same wedding year, the same stretch when Victoria was helping decorate their home, Meghan issued an order. Photographs of Harry standing next to David Beckham were prohibited. No images of the two men together were to be captured or distributed. David Beckham was, by multiple accounts, genuinely bewildered. He didn't discover until significantly later that the exclusion directive had originated directly with Meghan herself. And Bauer's reporting documents the reasoning. She didn't want any media competition from Beckham, and especially not from his wife Victoria. Sit with that for a moment. She had invited them to the wedding. She had accepted Victoria's help redecorating her home. But the instant David Beckham's face beside Harry's threatened to redirect even a single camera lens away from Meghan at a public function, that became intolerable. That was the line in the sand. And then came the accusation that obliterated the entire friendship. Meghan reportedly contacted David Beckham during what sources describe as a tense phone call, and accused Victoria of feeding stories about her to the British press. David Beckham was, according to multiple accounts, absolutely livid. And royal correspondent Kinsey Schofield has confirmed what actually happened. The leaker was a salon receptionist with, as she put it, a pair of loose lips. Not Victoria. Never Victoria. The accusation was wrong, demonstrably, provably wrong. But by the time the truth surfaced, the friendship had already been destroyed. And where does David Beckham stand today? He has publicly stated that whenever the Prince of Wales sends him a message asking him to do something, the answer is always yes. That is not neutrality. That is a man who lived through something, processed what it meant, and selected a side. And I think you and I both know which side is the one where the accusations turned out to be false. The Beckham episode isn't a footnote. It's the template. Bring someone in, accept their generosity, draw on their social capital, and the second their presence threatens to siphon even a sliver of attention away from yours, remove them. If they resist the removal, accuse them of disloyalty. And if the accusation later proves baseless, never correct the record, because by then, the relationship has already been buried and the narrative has rolled on. Keep watching for that template. You'll see it surface again. But a baseless accusation against a friend is socially damaging. What's structurally damaging, what carries genuine institutional and legal weight, is a formal document filed by someone working on the inside. And that document was filed 4 years before most people realize. October 2018, Jason Knopf. That name should register with you. He was Meghan's own communications secretary, not a reporter, not a critic, not someone with a pre-existing axe to grind. This was the man Prince Harry personally asked to help Meghan draft the now famous private letter to her estranged father, Thomas Markle. A trusted insider by every measurable definition, the person closest to the engine room of how Meghan's public image was being constructed and maintained. 2 months after helping draft that letter, Knopf sent a formal email to Simon Case, who at the time was serving as the private secretary to Prince William. He copied the Buckingham Palace Human Resources Department. And here is what that email stated, on the record, in Knopf's own words. He wrote that he was very concerned the Duchess had managed to bully 2 personal assistants out of the household within the previous year. He wrote that the Duchess seemed intent on always having someone in her sights. He described her as bullying a specific staff member and actively working to undermine that person's confidence. He referenced multiple reports from individuals who had witnessed what he called unacceptable behavior. And then Knauf wrote the line that should stop you in your tracks. He questioned whether the household policy on bullying and harassment applies to principals. Read that one more time. He wasn't simply reporting individual incidents. He was asking, in writing, addressed to the Human Resources Department, whether the workplace conduct rules of the royal household even extended to the person he worked for. That is not a grievance from someone nursing a personal complaint. That is not a disgruntled employee blowing off steam after a rough week. That is a written question from someone who already knows the answer and is documenting it anyway because the circumstances have become untenable. Now here is the institutional response, and this is where I need you to pay particularly close attention to the framing. Meghan's official reaction, delivered through a spokesperson in March of 2021, 3 full years after the complaint was filed, was the following. The Duchess is saddened by this latest attack on her character, particularly as someone who has been the target of bullying herself. Do you see what just took place? A formal human resources complaint submitted by her own communications secretary, a man the royal family trusted deeply enough to bring into the most sensitive personal correspondence, was reframed in a single sentence as an attack on a bullying victim. The accuser became the accused. The documented complaint became the latest attack. And the question of whether the rules apply was never publicly answered. Because here's what we know happened next. Harry reportedly asked Knauf not to pursue the complaint. Knauf resigned roughly a month later, and he went directly to work for Prince William. The most trusted insider transformed into the most informed adverse witness. He carried his knowledge, his documentation, and his professional reputation straight across to the other side of the palace wall. And the findings of Buckingham Palace's internal investigation into those allegations? Still sealed, never made public. The public, in all likelihood, will never learn what that investigation concluded. But the trajectory of the man who filed it tells you everything about how seriously the institution treated what he reported. Here is the section where the contracts begin doing the talking. Because corporate money doesn't operate on emotion. Corporate money operates on performance metrics, deliverables, and return on investment. And when multiple corporations independently arrive at the same conclusion about the same client inside the same window of time, that isn't bad luck. That is data. Harry and Meghan sign with Spotify. Reported value, $20 million, 3-year contract. The stated mission was a podcast series telling stories through diverse voices and perspectives. What was actually produced across the lifespan of that contract? 13 episodes of a single series titled Archetypes, 1 standalone holiday special, then silence. June 16, 2023. The deal officially terminates. And on that exact same day, a man named Bill Simmons goes on his own podcast and delivers what becomes the single most quoted assessment of the Sussex brand inside the entertainment industry. Simmons was the head of podcast innovation and monetization at Spotify. This is the man who built and sold The Ringer to Spotify for $196 million. He understands content economics the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He's not a gossip columnist. He's not a royal commentator. He is someone who evaluates content businesses professionally, and his verdict was one word: grifters. He called them the grifters, on the record, at full volume, on a podcast the entire industry tunes into. And then he said something even more telling. He said he needs to get drunk one night and finally tell the story of a Zoom call he had with Harry. A specific call, a specific pitch from Harry about a podcast concept. A story Simmons considers one of the best he possesses, and he still hasn't shared it. He said he needs alcohol on board before he can bring himself to release it. That isn't someone mildly annoyed by a business relationship that underperformed. That's someone who witnessed something specific, something that revealed how the Sussexes actually approach these deals, and who is calculating very deliberately when and how to deploy that information. That story exists somewhere. And it's sitting like an unexploded device in the middle of this entire narrative. Meanwhile, the Netflix arc tracks Spotify so precisely that if you laid the two timelines side by side, you'd suspect one had been copied from the other. The reported deal, $100 million. The initial documentary series that topped the platform's charts, but topped them because, and only because, it featured direct attacks on the British royal family. That was the material that generated viewership, not the storytelling, not the production craft, the controversy. The follow-up projects produced what one industry analysis described as no major splash. Netflix invested as an equity partner in Meghan's lifestyle brand. Netflix then exited that brand entirely. The original production deal was quietly downgraded from an overall arrangement to a first-look arrangement in the summer of 2025. The deal expired without renewal in July of 2025. 2 seasons of a lifestyle show titled With Love, Meghan aired. No third season has been announced. The pattern is identical. Sign big, promise more, deliver less, blame outside forces, exit quietly, move on to the next contract. The financial mathematics works out the same every single time. And I think the people writing the checks have finally started comparing notes. Because here's what happens when 3 separate corporations in the same industry independently reach the same conclusion. It stops being about one bad deal. It becomes a matter of due diligence. Every future partner, every prospective investor, every brand weighing an association runs the same calculation. They examine Spotify's outcome. They examine Netflix's outcome. They examine the William Morris Endeavor exit. And they ask themselves a simple question. What do those 3 organizations know that I don't? And the answer, increasingly, is sitting in the public record for anyone willing to read it. The track record has become the warning label. And the warning label keeps growing longer. Now I need you to step away from the contracts and the corporate collapses for a moment. Because beneath every executive who quietly walked away from this story, beneath every deal that expired without renewal, there's a human story. And it belongs to a woman who has never spoken about it publicly. Who, according to people who know her, still can't bring herself to. Her name is Jessica Mulroney. She was Meghan's best friend, not a celebrity acquaintance, not a strategic networking node. A genuine, years-deep friendship forged in Toronto long before anyone outside a Suits fan forum had ever heard the name Meghan Markle. Jessica introduced Meghan into influential Canadian social circles. She styled Meghan's wardrobe. She was the person Meghan trusted with the private, late-night details of her life that never landed in any interview. The conversations that happen after 11 at night, the ones that never get scripted, where you say the things you'd never repeat on camera. And at Meghan's wedding in May of 2018, the most-watched royal wedding of a generation, Jessica Mulroney's children served as the page boys and the bridesmaid. I need you to grasp the weight of that decision. You don't place someone's children in your wedding party as a networking move. You don't hand a woman's kids the rings and the flowers unless she is the person you trust most in the world. That is the single most intimate personal slot you can offer another human being on the most significant day of your life. 2 years later, June of 2020, Jessica Mulroney became involved in a social media controversy. She was accused of exhibiting white privilege during a public dispute with a lifestyle influencer. Her television appearances were canceled almost overnight. Her public career collapsed within days. She was living through one of the most painful, most exposed chapters of her adult life. And Meghan severed the relationship completely, immediately, publicly. Now, you might be tempted to extend the benefit of the doubt here. Perhaps the friendship had already been fading. Perhaps the distance had been mutual. Perhaps this was just 2 busy women in different countries drifting apart, as people sometimes do. But look at the calendar. June 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement was at its global peak. Meghan was actively constructing her identity as a racial justice advocate in America. Her entire brand pivot, the repositioning that would come to define her post-royal American persona, was unfolding in real time, and her closest personal friend had just become the center of a racial controversy. Jessica Mulroney wasn't merely emotionally inconvenient to keep close. She had become strategically necessary to cut. And what happened to Jessica afterward is, to my mind, the most quietly devastating detail in this entire story. A confidant described her experience this way. She was put through extraordinary pain in 2020 and has endured an emotional time since then, watching everything unfold in the media with inaccurate reports about her, completely unable to respond. Unable to respond. Because Jessica Mulroney, the woman who holds years of private conversations, personal confidences shared behind closed doors, knowledge that was never meant to surface, has remained completely silent. And sources close to the situation say Meghan is acutely aware of that silence and acutely aware of what could happen if it ever breaks. One insider told media outlets that publishers have been offering seven-figure sums for Jessica's memoir. The woman who held the flowers, who placed her children at the altar beside Meghan, discarded at precisely the moment her existence became a brand liability. That isn't a friendship that ended. That is a relationship that was liquidated. Now let me lay out what all of this actually cost in commercial terms. Because we're well past the territory of embarrassment or bad press cycles. We're inside structural, measurable, documented collapse. Begin with the trademark. In September of 2024, the United States Patent and Trademark Office rejected Meghan's application to register American Riviera Orchard as a protected trademark. The cited reason was that the name describes a geographic location, specifically the area surrounding her hometown of Montecito, California. And United States trademark law doesn't permit the registration of geographic descriptors as brand names. Read that again. She was constructing an entire lifestyle empire. Jams, teas, honey, wine, crepe mix, flour sprinkles, all of it anchored to a brand name that was legally unprotectable from the very first day. Someone either failed to run a basic trademark search before locking in the name, or someone ran the search, received the answer, and proceeded anyway. Either explanation is disqualifying for a business operation at this level. The February 2025 rebrand to As Ever wasn't a creative evolution. It was a legal emergency dressed up as a brand refresh. The foundation had been invalid from the beginning. Now track the staff departures, because the numbers alone narrate a story that no press release can override. 18 senior departures since 2018. That isn't a human resources challenge. That isn't the normal churn of a startup finding its footing. That is a pattern professionals in adjacent industries recognize instantly and discuss behind closed doors. Chief of Staff Josh Kettler resigned after 3 months in 2024. 3 months. His stated reasoning was that there were aspects of the position he wasn't comfortable with. The industry standard tenure for a chief of staff role is 3 to 5 years. 3 months isn't a career move. 3 months is an escape. Chief Communications Officer Meredith Maines resigned on December 26, 2025. Executive Director of the Archwell Foundation James Holt resigned on December 29, 2025. 3 days apart. End of year. The two most senior figures inside the Sussex communications and organizational structure walking out within 72 hours of each other. Royal commentator Helena Chard put it bluntly. She described Maines as a highly respected communications professional who would, without question, be safeguarding her own reputation from what Chard characterized as the Sussexes' potentially damaging and erratic behavior. And then Chard made the observation that, for me, slices straight to the core of every professional exit in this file. She said a communication strategy only works if all parties adhere to the plan. She wasn't claiming the strategy was bad, she was claiming the principal wasn't following it, that the people hired to manage the brand were being overridden by the person whose brand they had been hired to manage, that the communications team was losing internal arguments they should have been winning, because someone above them was making unilateral decisions in direct conflict with the agreed-upon approach. And here's the cultural artifact that surfaced from inside the institution years before the commercial world caught up. Former Palace staff coined the term the Sussex Survivors Club. Half-jokingly, they said, half. That phrase wasn't invented by tabloid headline writers. It was invented by the people who worked closest to them. And it keeps acquiring new members. So where does that leave us? Let me close out every thread I've opened. The Shield. Ari Emanuel and William Morris Endeavor supplied Meghan Markle with the press suppression apparatus that operated as effectively as any corporate communications machine in Hollywood. When the relationship reportedly collapsed in January of 2024, the protective wall vanished, and every negative story that had been bottled up began running simultaneously. The Variety report on Netflix tensions, the staff departures, the brand failures, all of it published in the unshielded window. The shield wasn't supplementary, it was structural. And when it came down, the flood was instantaneous. The document. Jason Nauf's formal complaint in October of 2018 remains the most institutionally significant piece of evidence in this story. A trusted insider, handpicked by Harry himself, formally questioned whether workplace bullying and harassment policies even applied to Meghan. The findings of the investigation were never released. Nauf left and went directly to work for William. The complaint itself was reframed by Meghan's team as an attack on a bullying victim. The institutional record was sealed, and the question Nauf actually posed, whether the rules apply to principals, has still never been answered publicly. The Friends. David and Victoria Beckham, barred from photographs, accused of press leaks that turned out to trace back to a salon receptionist, ultimately lost as allies. Jessica Mulroney, handed the most intimate role at the wedding, cut the instant her existence became a brand liability, and maintained in silence by the implicit understanding that she holds private knowledge the Sussexes can't afford to see in print. The Clooneys, Oprah Winfrey, Elton John, Gina Torres, Meghan's former castmate on Suits, said it publicly and without malice, "We don't have her number, we just don't." Not as a grievance, just as a fact. Elton John, one of the most loyal figures in British celebrity life, a man who stayed close to Harry out of genuine devotion to Princess Diana, reportedly now keeps contact with Meghan to an absolute minimum. One anonymous source, someone with a front-row seat to the entire 8-year arc of this story, summarized it in one sentence. The people who have stayed most loyal to them are beneath them and get something out of it. Everyone else, they fall out with. The contracts. Spotify signed a $20 million deal and received 13 episodes and a holiday special before the head of podcast monetization called them grifters on the record. Netflix signed a reported $100 million deal, watched its equity investment in the lifestyle brand collapse, downgraded the production arrangement, and allowed the deal to expire without renewal. The United States Patent and Trademark Office rejected the brand name on which the entire lifestyle empire was constructed. 18 senior staff members have departed since 2018, including a chief of staff who lasted 3 months and 2 executives who resigned 3 days apart at the very end of 2025. The spectators. At the 2025 Invictus Games, a wheelchair basketball match drew 43 paying attendees. An additional 100 people were reportedly bussed in and positioned around Harry and Meghan for photographs. The man who walked away from a centuries-old institution with actual infrastructure, staffed embassies, genuine global diplomatic reach, and a billion-dollar brand assembled across generations, that man's flagship independent event required stage management to manufacture the illusion of public interest. The brand isn't merely failing. The brand is being kept on life support and photographed to appear healthy. And then there's Harry. The man who authored a memoir attacking his own brother's appearance and his family's private grief. The man who now arrives at polo matches alone, book launches alone, charity events where 43 people paid to be in the room, and another 100 were brought in to populate the photograph. In March of 2025, Harry resigned from Sintabale, his African charity supporting children affected by HIV, a charity he co-founded. Alongside him, the co-founder, the chief executive, and the entire board of trustees also walked. Harry hadn't visited the charity for 4 years. He returned in October of 2024, reportedly attempted to remove the chair, failed, and then resigned. 4 years of absence, 1 visit, an immediate grab at control, an immediate failure, exit. That sequence tells you everything about the operating model. And Frogmore Cottage, that wasn't just a residence. It was the final physical tether to the institution that gave them their entire commercial value. Every Netflix deal, every Spotify contract, every brand partnership was priced against the worth of their royal association. The titles, the access, the the reflected authority of the British Crown. King Charles took that property away, and with it, the last tangible justification for the entire post-royal venture. They left the monarchy to become something independent. They spent 6 years trying, and the most honest public assessment of what they actually became was delivered by a man on a podcast. On a Friday afternoon in June of 2023, Bill Simmons, a man who had signed a $20 million deal with them, who had sat opposite them on Zoom calls, who had watched the operation from the inside. He said grifters, on the record, at full volume. And then he said he has a story, a specific story, from a specific Zoom call, involving a specific pitch from Harry. One he considers one of the best stories he holds, and he still hasn't released it. That story exists. It's sitting somewhere, waiting. And I think that call, whatever Harry said on it, whatever he pitched, whatever it revealed about how they genuinely believe this all works, is the single piece of evidence that ties this entire pattern into one clean line. Every departure, every accusation, every contract that expired without an announcement, every friend who was cut, every staff member who walked, every brand that was staged for photographs. All of it traces back to one operating principle that the people closest to the machine keep describing in different words, but with the same meaning. So I'll leave you with the question I can't answer, the one Bill Simmons is keeping tucked away for the night he finally opens that bottle. What did Harry say on that Zoom call? And when that story finally surfaces, will it surprise anyone who's been paying attention? Or will it just confirm what 43 empty seats in Vancouver already told us? Because here is what I keep coming back to. Every person and every corporation in this story followed the same arc. Enthusiasm at the start, proximity in the middle, and a quiet, carefully managed exit at the end. The Beckhams, Spotify, Netflix, William Morris Endeavor, Jessica Mulrooney, Jason Nauf, 18 senior staff members. The pattern is so consistent, so mechanically repetitive, that at a certain point you stop asking what went wrong inside each individual relationship, and you start asking what the common denominator is that links every single one of them. And the answer is sitting right there in the record, documented by the people who stood closest, confirmed by the corporations that wrote the largest checks, and summarized most efficiently by a man who simply said one word, and then kept the best part of the story for later.